great palace rose high above the Star City, glowing with silver lights that made the night itself seem small. The queen walked slowly along the balcony, her gown trailing against the polished stone, her eyes scanning the horizon where countless ships rested in the skies. She had grown used to power, to endless guests and envoys from every corner of the wide human dominions. Every year, men of wealth and rank came to seek her favor, hoping to stand beside her throne. They came with banners, with treasures, with soldiers singing of victory. They came dressed in armor that gleamed like suns, and with words rehearsed to flatter her, yet none of them left a mark on her spirit. They showed her strength, but it was a strength she had learned to expect, a strength that was loud, but somehow hollow. That evening, as the court prepared for another reception, she stood waiting. Below her balcony, gardeners tended to the white flame trees that glowed with a soft light. Musicians tuned their instruments in the courtyard, and great doors opened to welcome another procession. The queen kept her face calm, but her heart felt the familiar fatigue of repetition. Again, there would be proud voices. Again, there would be men who thought strength must always look like war. The trumpets sounded, and one by one the guests entered the hall. Her ministers called out each name, praising each accomplishment, as if mere titles could win her regard. Some had commanded fleets. Some had overseen the shaping of new colonies. Some spoke of the wealth of their families. And then, almost as an afterthought, another man stepped forward. His name was Daniel Carter. No fleet was mentioned beside him, no castles or riches. He did not wear shining armor, nor did he march with soldiers at his side. His clothes were plain, though clean, and his eyes met hers without fear or hesitation. The courtiers exchanged whispers, some even covering their laughter with coughs. What was this unprepared man doing in the hall of rulers and generals? But the queen, instead of sharing their dismissal, leaned forward in curiosity. There was something in his calmness that made her pause. Introductions followed. The men of rank boasted of victories. They raised their voices when they spoke of war, and they bent their heads only after reciting long tales of triumph. When it was Daniel's turn, he simply bowed once, not too low, not with exaggerated respect, but with sincerity. He said no grand words, did not promise her rule over new lands, or speak of his bloodline. He only said his name again and waited. The queen let the court proceed as planned. Wine was poured, orchestras played, and the tall chamber filled with music and competing voices. Yet her attention was drawn again and again to this plain man from a modest world. While others polished their stories, Daniel listened to those around him. When servants passed, he thanked them. When he spoke directly, not hiding behind titles, not exaggerating what he was. Later that night, when the dances slowed, the queen called for Daniel to walk with her in the royal gardens. Lanterns floated above them, casting golden light on the flowers. Around them, the murmurs of the envious suitors followed, but she paid them no mind. She asked Daniel of his life, expecting at least some tale of titles hidden behind his modest entry. But he only shrugged softly and said he had lived among ordinary people. He had worked with his hands. He had seen days of hunger and days of effort without reward. And yet none of it had broken him. He said it simply without seeking pity or praise. She studied him then, and she felt a spark of something she had not felt in many years. The strength she usually witnessed was the strength that demanded attention, the strength of men declaring victories. But in Daniel, she saw another kind. He carried no shields, no proof of conquest. His strength was quieter, older, something written into the way he stood and the way he looked at the world without fear. The night ended and the guests departed, returning to their ships or estates. But Daniel lingered, still calm, still without hurry. The queen returned to her balcony, looking once more across her shining city. Yet her thoughts no longer circled around fleets and titles. They circled around the man who had stood before her without a mask, without armor, and in doing so had unsettled her more than 1,000 shining champions had ever managed. The next morning, the palace was filled with whispers. The nobles and generals could speak of nothing else except the strange choice of the queen to invite Daniel into the coming trials. The trials were set each year for those who wished to prove their worth beside her throne. They were not small games. They were challenges made to test a person's body, mind, and heart. Many men of power had failed them, and the court believed that only those with towering armies or grand machines could hope to win. To hear that a plain man from Earth had been admitted sounded like a foolish dream to them. The queen listened to their voices, but gave no reply. Outwardly, she remained calm, hands folded with grace, giving orders about preparations. But inside, her mind kept returning to Daniel. She wondered how such a quiet man, so without wealth or armor, would stand in tests that had broken princes and captains. She told herself it was curiosity and nothing more. Yet, even she knew that her curiosity carried a strange warmth that grew with every hour. When Daniel walked into the training grounds to begin the first test, all eyes turned to him. Ground stretched wide, marked with stones and walls, built for survival challenges. Competitors were told to use what lay around them only. No machines, no carrying armies, no wealth. The task was simple to announce but hard to master. Each must build a shelter on an empty plain using only their mind and their hands. The captains from other houses grinned with ease. They had studied building methods taught in their schools. Many already carried secret tools hidden in their belts. They began to gather rocks and metals, their movements stiff and proud, as though the trial was already theirs. Daniel, however, did not race forward. He walked slowly around the ground, bending here to touch the sand, lifting there to study a stone. The other men laughed, saying he looked like a farmer lost in a city. The queen sat on her high seat beside her council. She watched silently while her ministers whispered that he would be the first to fail. But as the hours passed, their certainty grew uneasy. For while the others built half-formed walls that toppled against wind, Daniel laid out his stones with care. He studied the flow of the breeze and curved his structure so it stood firm against it. He cut branches from the plainest few trees and wove them together into a roof that gave shade. Where the ground sloped, he dug a small trench so water would not gather inside. By the fall of day, Daniel's shelter did not only stand firm, it offered a place where anyone could sit, rest, and survive a storm if one came.
Oh.
The queen stepped down from her throne as she always did to judge the efforts. She walked past half-fallen shelters where workers argued over broken edges. Then she came to Daniel's small home. It was not large nor grand, but it was whole. She entered and felt the cool air under the woven roof. Her fingers brushed the stone curves and saw how they held strong without even a single crack. She said nothing at first, only nodded. Daniel bowed gently and explained in his plain voice that people on Earth had long lived by making the most with very little. "We learn that strength is not in what you own," he said softly, "but in how you shape what you find." Those words carried across the grounds, and though many sneered, some were struck silent. The rage of one noble made him shout that Daniel had cheated somehow. But the judges, after close search, confirmed that he had used only what the plane had given. There was no grand trick, no secret tool, only patience, skill, and an unbending spirit. That night, music filled the palace again. The suitors returned wearing their jeweled clothes, but their eyes glanced often toward Daniel. It's no longer only with laughter, but also with forced smiles of rivalry. The queen remained calm on her throne, yet her eyes betrayed a small spark each time they drifted toward him. She did not show it openly, but when she returned to her chamber, she admitted to herself what she had seen that day, where others had rushed with pride and fallen under their own hands. Daniel had endured. He did not fear the whispers, nor did he struggle to please. He simply worked until the shelter stood and let it speak for him. For the first time in many long years, the queen felt the shadow of amazement touch her heart. In a hall full of men who shouted their power, it was the quiet man who had built something lasting. And though the road of trials would go on, she knew already that the story had begun to change. The days that followed were filled with new trials. Each test was harder than the last, designed not only to measure strength of the body, but also the edge of the mind and the weight of the heart. Competitors who had walked into the palace with loud voices and golden armor grew quieter as failures began to scatter through the group. But Daniel stood among them with the same calm eyes and steady hands, never boasting, never trembling. For the second trial, the suitors were placed in a dark chamber lined with shifting walls. Each person was given a torch that burned for only a short time. The challenge was to find the one hidden path that led to the gate outside. Most suitors rushed forward with their torches high, shouting commands to servants who waited outside the walls. Some pushed through corridors blindly, filled with the belief that speed alone would bring them victory. But walls closed, lights went out, and many were left lost and helpless. Daniel, however, moved differently. He paused often, listening to the sound of air moving through cracks. He placed small stones behind him as markers, so he would never lose his way. Instead of rushing forward, he treated every turn as a puzzle, every echo as a guide. Hours passed, and while many had already given up, Daniel emerged from the gate just as his torch grew dim. The queen herself was waiting at the gate, and her lips curved into a faint smile when she saw him step into the light. The third trial tested courage. A wide bridge stretched over rushing water that carried sharp rocks below. Each suitor was told to cross while strong winds shook the path. Soldiers suggested that one could wait for calmer weather, but the rules of the trial allowed no delay. Boasting loudly, two princes strode onto the bridge at once, their cloaks whipping in the air, their jewels flashing. A gust pushed one to his knees, another lost his torch to the river. Daniel said nothing. He gripped the rail with one hand and moved slowly, step by step, with no pride, with no rush, with only patient balance. He never fell, never faltered, though the wind screamed louder than 1,000 voices. When he reached the far side, his quiet steps had outlasted the shouts of others. The court had grown restless. Many nobles whispered that the trials were being disgraced by this humble man. Others argued that the queen should never consider him, even if he passed. To them, power was measured only by armies and treasures. Yet the queen, though she listened, gave no sign of what rested in her heart. She simply told Daniel to be ready for the final test. That night, as the palace grew still, Daniel stood alone under the stars of the garden courtyard. The queen found him there, leaning against the stone wall, his gaze lifted to the sky. He bowed gently when she appeared, but she told him not to bow so deeply. She asked him why he walked these trials with such calm, why he chose to face them without speaking loud promises as the others did. He thought for a moment before answering. His voice was low, but steady, because strength is not in the noise. Strength is being able to stand when everything tells you to fall. On Earth, we have learned that storms always come. We do not crush them. We wait them out. We find ways to endure. A man's worth is not how high he stands above others, but how he holds standing when there is nothing left but the test itself. For a long while she was silent. The music of distant halls could not reach them here. Only the sound of leaves moving with the breeze and the steady river outside the wall filled the air. She looked at him, and she realized that she had never heard such a truth from any of the kings or princes who had entered her palace. Their strength had always been displayed like a torch that burned bright but soon died. Daniel's strength was different. It was quiet yet unbroken, calm yet certain. The queen nodded and turned away, but her heart was not steady as it had once been. For the first time, she wondered if perhaps the man she had thought would be weakest among them all might prove to be the only one who truly understood what it meant to walk at her side. When the morning bell rang through the palace, announcing the final trial, the nobles filled the seats with restless eyes. Soldiers polished their weapons, lords whispered predictions. The queen walked to her seat in silence. Her crown shone like fire in the morning sun. The suitors gathered in a line, their faces filled with pride or fear. Daniel stood at the end of the line, still plain, still quiet, the only one who did not shift to show his confidence. And though not a word was spoken, many in the crowd felt that the last test would change everything. The hall was silent when the queen stood to speak. Her voice carried a weight that silenced even the loudest whispers of the nobles. She announced that the final trial would not be a puzzle of walls or a walk across storms. This time the test would be of leadership, wisdom, and courage in the face of danger. Each suitor would be given the same impossible problem. A fleet of enemies marching across the stars, threatening to strike the heart of her dominion. What would they face it? And what choices would they make? The test would not be about force, but strategy. The men stepped forward one by one, each eager to impress her with words of power. A proud general declared he would build walls of steel, so high and wide that no enemy could climb them. A prince declared he would send wave after wave of soldiers until the enemies drowned under fear. Another said he would set fire to whole worlds if needed, so that none could stand against him. The queen listened to all their answers without comment. She merely marked them in silence, her face calm though her heart was heavy. At last it was Daniel's turn. He walked forward with slow steps, bowing once before her throne. Unlike the others, he did not rush his words. He let the stillness stretch before speaking, his calm voice rising so all could hear. He said he would not first think of walls or burning fire. He would study the enemy, learn their weakness, and cut off their strength at the root. He would not waste the lives of his people in waves of blood. He said that the strongest victories come from turning disadvantage into advantage, not from crushing lives under pride. Lifted his head and added, on earth, we learn to fight when outnumbered. We learn to win by turning surprise into our weapon. You do not always need the sharpest sword. You need the eyes to see what others ignore. You need the patience to wait for the time when one move can change everything. The hall was filled with murmurs, for none had spoken with such plain words before. Some nobles laughed, mocking him as a farmer, speaking of battles beyond his reach. But the queen's eyes were fixed on him, and her heart quickened, for in him she saw something no grand voice had carried. She saw honesty. She saw wisdom earned through hardship, not handed down by birth. To complete the trial, the court staged a test in the great chamber. A giant table filled with glowing markers that showed fleets, cities, and armies. Each suitor was allowed to move the pieces as a war simulation. One by one, they placed their fleets in lines of grand display, walls shining bright, towers raised high. Daniel watched them quietly, his arms folded. When it was his turn, he stepped forward without hesitation, did not arrange his forces into grand walls. Instead, he moved a small group of ships into shadows near an empty moon. He spread his forces thin, not for display, but to stretch the enemy wide. When the signal began, his play revealed its wisdom. The enemy model rushed forward at grand walls, and soon broke through them, shattering the works of generals who relied only on pride. But when the enemy moved toward Daniel's thin lines, his hidden force struck from behind, cutting supply before the enemy even realized they were trapped. With one quiet move, the enemy model stumbled, faltered, and fell. The judges were silent. Even the loud nobles who had mocked him found no laughter left. The queen allowed herself the smallest smile, sharp as light. Still, the whispers began as the suitors left the chamber. Nobles feared him now, for the queen's eyes no longer drifted to princes of gold or lords of steel. Her gaze found Daniel before it found the rest. They muttered that she stood in danger. They muttered that her throne would fall if she chose a man so plain. Plans whispered in secret rooms grew louder. Envy twisted like smoke across the palace halls. That same night, news reached the queen of a real threat on the horizon. Not imagined, not staged, but real. A rival house had grown bold, furious over her trials and her interest in the strange man. They gathered fleets and prepared to march against her realm. The council urged her to turn Daniel away, to cling to stronger bonds with armies beside her. But when she looked at Daniel, standing firm, she felt no fear. His voice came to her as steady as it had always been. You know their strength, he said, but they do not know ours. We have faced storms without walls. We have crossed rivers without bridges. We do not need to outshine them. We need only to outlast them. And in that moment, she knew she would not turn from him. Whatever storm was about to rise, she would face it with him. The rival fleets might come with fire and steel, but she had already seen in Daniel a strength deeper than weapons. She would trust it, even if the whole court turned against her. The palace bells rang like thunder in the early hours of the morning. From the high towers, the queen looked out to the black horizon of space, and saw lights moving like fireflies gathering for war. The rival house had come sooner than the council expected. Hundreds of ships filled the skies beyond her world, shields glimmering, weapons ready. The people in the city below gathered in fear. Some prayed, some hid, and some whispered that the queen had doomed them by putting her trust in a man too plain, a man unworthy of her throne. The council hurried to her side with heavy voices. They told her to give up the strange human who had won too many trials. They said perhaps if she sent him away, the rival house would turn back. But she refused. Her eyes were steady, though her heart faced the weight of fire on the horizon. She would not betray the man she had seen stand so strong when all others had shouted only words. Daniel stood in the great hall as the voices rose around him. Unlike the nobles, he did not wear polished armor or glowing marks on his chest. His clothes were simple, his face calm. When the queen asked for his counsel, he stepped forward. His voice was so quiet that at first many did not believe he truly meant to give advice. But then he spread his plan across the great table, moving the small glowing markers with steady hands. He said they could not fight the enemy with strength alone. Too many ships, too many soldiers, too many weapons. To battle them head-on would be suicide. Instead, he spoke of patience, of waiting, of letting the enemy fall, because of their own hunger for conquest. He placed her ships in smaller lines, hidden in the shadow of nearby moons and drifting among empty paths where no eyes would look. He used narrow passages and rocks hanging in space itself to cloak her forces. He turned emptiness into a shield. The generals mocked him at first, saying no plan could win against numbers so great. But the queen raised her hand and ended their complaints. She told them to do as Daniel said. They obeyed, though fear and doubt shook their steps. The fleets of the rival house moved closer. Their commanders were certain of victory. The queen's forces seemed weak, scattered, unready. But when they pushed deep into her star system, Daniel's plan became clear. Small groups struck without warning from the shadows. They did not fight to destroy outright, but to cut supply ships from the main fleet. Then they fled, drawing the enemy further and further away from their centers. As days passed, the stronger fleet found itself stretched too thin. Their food ran low, their engines burned too much fuel, and their formations broke apart. Each time they tried to regather, another hidden strike cut them again. The queen watched the battle unfold from her command tower, her heart steady for the first time in days. She saw how Daniel's quiet mind turned impossible odds into victories made, not with brute force, but with simple, careful choices. When the rival house tried to retreat and restore order, her fleet struck their center in one sharp move. By the end of the week, the enemy scattered in shame, unable to hold their pride together.
Oh.
The city below sang with joy, the bells now ringing with triumph. The people shouted her name and called her savior of the Dominion. But the queen knew the truth. It had not been her council, nor her generals who had saved her throne. It was the quiet man who had walked into her palace with no crown, no armor, and no proof of greatness, except his steady spirit. That evening, when the halls were filled with music, she asked Daniel to walk once more with her in the gardens. Lanterns floated above, just as they had on the night she first truly looked at him. She turned to him with eyes that carried both pride and wonder. "You have shown me strength greater than any I have ever seen," she said. "Not the strength of fire, but the strength of heart. You faced storms without fear, and you turned weakness itself into power." Daniel bowed his head, but his reply was simple. Strength is not about crushing. It is about protecting. It is about standing when others fall. On Earth, we learn that the greatest gift we have is to endure. I only wish to share that gift. The queen took his hand gently, and in that moment she knew for certain what her heart had long whispered. Before her court and her people, she declared Daniel not only victor of the trials, but her chosen consort, her equal. The nobles, who once laughed, lowered their heads. The people cheered. Daniel stood at her side, still calm, still plain, but in truth stronger than any warrior who had marched before him. That night the stars seemed brighter, as if they too bowed to the quiet strength of the man who had taught a queen what true power truly was.